I didn't hear it at first, the sharp crack inside the metal bin, the kind of sound that makes you freeze before your mind has time to understand. And I stood there in the doorway, staring at the scattered fragments of something I had kept close to my heart for longer than I could admit even to myself. And the person standing over the broken pieces looked so calm, like they had just finished a simple chore, wiping their hands as if brushing off dust from an old shelf. And a strange trembling went through my arms. Not fear, not yet, something heavier, something that felt like the floor inside me shifting. And I tried to ask what they had done, but the words came out small, as if my throat had forgotten how to form sound. And the person who had shattered what mattered most to me only shrugged with that practiced half-smile that never reached their eyes, telling me it was time to move on, that I had lived long enough, wrapped in old memories, that today was supposed to mark a new beginning. And the kitchen felt wrong suddenly, too bright, too clean, too unfamiliar, like a stage built for someone else's performance. And everyone sitting in the next room waiting for a celebration they didn't realize had already died inside me. I felt their eyes flick toward me, confused, unsure, but no one spoke. No one moved, because the atmosphere had shattered just as loudly as the pieces in the bin, and the person who had caused it. All stepped closer with a folder in hand, talking about plans and transitions and futures that didn't belong to me. Plans I had never heard of. Decisions made without my breath, without my heartbeat counted in. I could feel the weight of the papers before even touching them, the way someone feels an oncoming storm in their bones, and my hands shook, not from weakness but from the truth, blooming slowly, that this had never been about helping me. It had never been about family. It had always been about control, the kind that hides behind polite smiles and smooth suggestions and subtle guilt, threaded into every sentence, the kind that turns something sacred into an obstacle to be cleared. I felt the walls press inward, the clock ticking too loudly above the sink, digging into my ears, like it wanted to warn me of something, and I asked again very quietly why they had done it, why the one thing I had protected was tossed aside like nothing. And they answered so simply, so casually, that for the moment I felt the world tilt. Because how could someone speak about endings with such ease? How could they speak about my memories like they were clutter, to be swept out of the way? The person beside them, the one who should have understood me, the one I had fed, clothed, raised, held through sleepless nights, stood there, unable to look at me, tears pooled but held back by something heavier than loyalty. Something shaped by months, maybe years, of whispered poison and half-truths and practiced concerns that weren't concerns at all. And when I asked them gently if this was what they wanted, if this destruction, this takeover, this coldness was really the future they had chosen, their silence answered for them, the kind of silence that doesn't drift softly, but lands like a stone on the chest. And for a heartbeat I thought I felt myself shrinking the way someone intended for me to shrink, until their shape fit where mine had stood. But something inside me surged instead, not anger, not yet, but a clarity, so sharp it almost cut, and I stepped past the person who had broken what mattered and reached into the prom bin, carefully gathering the scattered pieces with steady fingers, feeling the cold edge of each shard press into my palm like a reminder, like a promise, and I placed them on the counter without shaking. And the person behind me said I was making a mistake, but I heard something different, something like fear dressed as authority, something like desperation under confidence. And that was when I knew, fully knew, that this wasn't about my well-being. This wasn't about age or struggle or stability. This was about someone trying to carve a place for themselves out of the life I had already built stone by stone, dawn after dawn. And I told them quietly this conversation was over, and told them to leave my home. And the look that crossed their face wasn't surprise, it was annoyance, the kind people show when a plan doesn't snap perfectly into place. And the person beside them, the one whose hand they grabbed, hesitated just long enough for my heart to crack, but not enough to change the ending of that moment. And when the door finally shut behind them, the house felt heavier than before, the leftover holiday smell clinging to the air like a memory, refusing to fade. And I stood there with the broken pieces in my hands, understanding for the first time that something deeper had shattered, something that would not be fixed with glue or time or apologies, something that would change every morning after this. And in that quiet, crushing stillness I made a promise, not out loud, not for anyone else, but inside myself, the kind of promise forged in pressure and grief and something fierce that had been sleeping for too long, a promise that I would not let anyone rewrite the life I had bled for, that I would not be pushed aside, that I would not be made small ever again. I kept telling myself I should feel something other than this sharp buzzing under my skin, but all I could think about was the way the urn had broken, the way the fragments hit the trash bag and disappeared under the smell of old leftovers. And the woman I used to be just went silent inside me as the man married to my daughter kept talking like he hadn't just tossed the last piece of the person I loved into garbage. I kept hearing his voice circling me like a mosquito, saying things about future and progress, and how someone like me was some kind of dead weight, and the daughter I raised stood behind, him trembling but still letting him speak for her, and I felt a kind of cracking inside my chest, not the grief from before, but something harder, something older, something that had been waiting quiet for too long. I stared at the stack of papers he pushed across my counter. The new world he wanted me to. Step aside for the world, he said. I was too old to keep up with, and all I could think was how strange it felt to be erased in your own kitchen, with your own bread cooling behind you, like a witness too polite to interrupt. I tried to listen, really. Listen to the daughter I carried for 9 months and raised through fevers and heartbreaks, but her voice came out thin and practiced like she'd been taught. The script by someone who didn't know me at all, and I felt that buzzing again under my sternum, the feeling that tells you something is wrong. Long before the words make sense, he kept pointing at things he didn't understand, calling them failures when they were just the rhythm of a small life that meant something simple and honest, and he didn't know that I had already decided long ago that people like him only see the surface of things. They never think to lift the rug because they are too sure they already own the house. I watched him talk about my hands shaking as if age were a moral flaw, as if years spent building something with your own fingers should disqualify you from touching it. Now I watched the daughter who had once stood on a stool beside me to learn how to braid dough. Now look at me, like she was waiting for permission to abandon me, and there was a moment, a single breath, where something inside me almost reached for her to pull her back before she drifted too far into someone else's orbit. But then he opened his mouth again and said, I was slowing her down, and something snapped cleanly inside me, the way a bone breaks and heals stronger. I didn't argue because arguing gives someone power I didn't need to give him. I just held the pieces of the broken urn, cupped in my hands like something sacred, while he leaned against my counter as if he'd built this place himself, as if he hadn't just wiped away the last physical trace of the man who built this life with me. Brick by brick, morning by morning, loaf by loaf. He kept repeating the word future, as if the past were disposable, as if love were a thing you scraped off your shoe when it stopped being useful. And the daughter I raised didn't stop him, not once, not even when he twisted the truth into shapes. She couldn't recognize I felt something cold slide through me, not bitterness, not shock, something quieter, something that felt like a door closing gently but firmly. Between me and the two people standing in my kitchen, I realized in that moment that they didn't know who I was. Not really, they knew the version of me. I allowed the world to see the widow who still baked bread at 4 in the morning, the woman who worked too hard for too little, the one everyone assumed would bend if pushed gently enough. But they didn't know the parts I never put on, display the discipline, the foresight, the knowledge passed down from generations of women who understood that survival is not luck, it is strategy. They didn't know that. Everything they believed about me was what I wanted them to believe, that the simple notebooks were not the real ledgers, that the woman they saw as fragile had built something no one could take without consequences. The man kept talking about safety and risk, like he was giving me a lesson in how the world worked while he didn't even see the danger he was creating for himself, with every sentence, every lie, every threat. And the daughter I loved looked at me with confusion, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't relieved to be rescued by someone who thought he was smarter, stronger, more capable, when all he was showing me was how small he truly was. When he finally said, I was making a mistake, felt something inside me. Not fear, not dread, something almost like clarity, a stillness after a storm, when the debris settles and you can finally see what has been ruined and what is still standing. I watched them walk out my door hand in hand, and the quiet that followed was heavier than grief. It felt like betrayal sewn into the walls of my own home. And for a moment I stood there, not moving, breathing shallowly, while the pieces of the urn lay cold on the counter, reflecting the kitchen lights like broken ice. I didn't cry, I thought. I might, but instead something steady arose in me, a kind of calm that comes only when a person realizes there is nothing left to lose from telling the truth and nothing left to gain from staying small. I picked up the phone with a hand that did not shake and dialed a number I had never needed to call. Out of desperation before, only partnership, only trust the person on the other end, answered on the second ring, and I told the truth plainly, quietly, without ceremony. And when I hung up, I stood in the middle of my kitchen and felt an old strength wake up inside me, the strength I had softened for family, the strength I had hidden under gentleness and bread dough. I realized they had made a mistake, a fatal one, they thought. I was alone, but I wasn't. They thought I was weak, but I wasn't. They thought I didn't know the value of what I'd built, but I knew every inch, every nail, every dollar, every sacrifice. And that night, for the first time since the man I loved died, I felt him close, not in grief but in resolve, like he was standing behind me, reminding me of something I had forgotten, something he had whispered once, when he knew his time was running short, that the world will try to shrink you if you let it, but you don't let them. You stay whole, you stay tall, you stay yours. And I knew then that the fight was coming, not because I wanted it, but because it was already here, and because some things are worth protecting even if the people you're protecting them from carry your blood or share your name. I turned off the kitchen lights and stood in the quiet house, and felt that stillness settle deeper, a warning, a promise, a beginning. I kept replaying the moment they walked out the door, the way the air folded in on itself, after the woman who came from my own body chose the person beside her instead of the truth standing right in front of her, and it pressed on my chest in a way that felt almost physical, like someone was sitting there waiting for me to crack, but I didn't. I moved through the house like someone twice my age and somehow younger all at once, checking locks, turning off burners, picking up the shards of the container that once held the last pieces of the person I loved, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation that the house itself was watching, me breathing with me, waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't sleep long that night, maybe half an hour at a time, drifting into shallow dreams where the sound of ceramic breaking kept waking me. I kept seeing the smirk on the man's face, the glitter of ambition not earned but stolen, the kind of hunger that doesn't come from need but from entitlement. And every time I opened my eyes, the room felt colder, like his words had seeped into the walls. But morning came anyway. It always does. I forced myself out of bed before the sun was willing to show itself, and made my way downstairs where the backer ovens waited, patient, loyal, steady, in a world where people weren't. I turned on the lights and watched the familiar glow spread across the countertops, across the bowls and scales and trays, and for a moment I felt the ghost of a life that made sense. But even that warmth couldn't erase the heaviness running along my spine, the knowledge that what had happened yesterday wasn't an isolated moment, but the beginning of something bigger, something darker, something I needed to prepare for. I moved automatically, measuring flour, warming water, activating yeast, and the motions anchored me, even as my thoughts spun unbearably fast around everything He wasn't supposed to feel anger, disappointment, grief, the sharp humiliation of being treated as if I was someone to be replaced, someone too old to matter, someone whose entire lifetime of work could be summed up as outdated, like the grain under my fingernails, didn't build anything worth respecting. But somewhere under that mess of emotion, something else throbbed quietly, a pulse of defiance, low, steady, dangerous. By the time the dough began to rise, the sky had brightened, and I could hear the first footsteps of early customers outside. Even though the sign on the door said closed, they knocked anyway, soft, polite, insistent, like they knew I needed company, even if I didn't ask for it. I let them in one by one, neighbors, regulars, kids who'd grown up eating the bread of this place, elders who knew my story better than some relatives ever cared to, and they didn't ask what happened. They didn't pry. They simply bought loaves and pastries and sat at the old wooden tables, sipping coffee, breathing life back into the place and into me. And every pair of eyes that met mine seemed to say, "We're here, we see. You're not alone." And for the first time since yesterday's Disaster. I felt something warm in my chest, something like belonging, the kind no one can take because it doesn't live in papers or contracts or property lines. It lives in the people who show up without being asked. After the rush faded, found myself staring at the empty bakery and wondering where. The daughter I raised had gone, the one who used to fall asleep on flour sacks, the one who used to ask me what love felt like, and listen to my answers as if they were gospel. I wondered how long the person beside her had been whispering poison in her ear, twisting facts, bending truths, planting seeds of doubt, until she couldn't recognize the voice from his. I wondered why she didn't see through it, or maybe she did, maybe she saw it, and didn't want to face the shame of admitting she'd chosen wrong. People cling harder to lies when truth makes them look foolish, and I knew that too well. I spent the afternoon in the office, the small back room where the real legacy of this place lived, in neat ledgers, hidden behind a false wall that only 3 living people knew about. I pulled them out one by one, the neat columns of ink, the calculations done by hand, the proof that every dollar had been accounted for, not to show off wealth, but to protect it, the habits of a lifetime, shaped by a grandmother who believed survival required subtlety and a husband who trusted me with everything we built together. I thought about the daughter who believed she'd paid her own way through school because the person she married convinced her of it. I thought about the way the man had spoken so boldly about my so-called failing bookkeeping, not realizing he was looking at decoys designed specifically for greedy eyes. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt tired, bone deep, tired of being underestimated, tired of being sweet, polite, manageable. And maybe that was the moment the shift truly happened, not when they pressured me, not when they broke what could never be replaced, but in this quiet room where I finally admitted to myself that letting them think I was weak was no longer protection. It was an invitation. For more harm. The sun had set by the time I stepped outside again, and the street was empty, shadows stretching long across the pavement. I locked the door behind me and headed upstairs to the apartment, where the walls still held the scent of memories I wasn't ready to let go of. I heated leftover tea and sat at the small dining table, listening to the creak of the building settling around me, and then the phone rang, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. I froze for a moment, every muscle tensing because I knew who it had to be, but I forced myself to answer, breathing shallowly into the receiver. The voice on the other end cracked as soon as it spoke, the voice I had soothed through fevers and heartbreaks, now trembling like a child again, and all the anger I had carefully stacked inside me wavered as she spilled apology after apology, words tripping over each other too fast, too desperate to be lies. She said she didn't know, she said she didn't see. She said she was scared and confused, and pulled in directions she didn't understand. She said she never meant to hurt me, but intentions don't erase actions, and love doesn't erase damage. I listened quietly, letting her voice run until it burned out into silence. And when I finally spoke, I didn't yell, I didn't shake, I didn't let my heart lead. I let truth lead, the gentle, unvarnished truth of a woman who has finally stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I told her what she needed to hear, not what she wanted to hear. That love without boundaries invites destruction. That choosing someone who harms your family is still a choice. That healing requires accountability. That coming back means nothing if she doesn't understand why she left. And what she broke, I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Some truths are too heavy for the person still climbing out of a hole. Someone else dug around them, but I said enough. And when we finally hung up, I rested my head on the cool surface of the table and let the quiet wrap around me. Not peace, not yet, but something close, something possible. And as I sat there, I realized this wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of reclaiming something that had been mine all along. Not just a business, not just a home, but my dignity, my voice, my place in a world that had tried to push me into a corner. I wasn't going to let anyone make me small again. The next move was mine, and I had already decided what it would be. I woke before the alarm, the kind of waking where the air feels heavier than your own breath, and for a moment I didn't know if it was dread sitting on my chest or a warning pressing into my ribs, but either way it pushed me out of bed long. Before dawn could pretend to be comforting, I moved through the apartment quietly, almost reverent, almost ritual, the way grief makes you move when you're scared of disturbing something. You can't name the ovens downstairs, hummed in my mind before I even turned them on, like they'd been waiting for me, like they were more faithful than the people who claimed to love me. I stepped into the bakery and felt the cold nip at my cheeks, a reminder that the world outside doesn't pause for heartbreak or betrayal. I turned on the lights, one switch at a time, watching the space brighten into something warm, something alive, something stubborn enough to keep going. No matter who tried to tear it down, I started kneading dough, letting my hands sink into it, pressing out the tension, pressing out the fear, pressing out the echo of a man's voice, telling me I was obsolete, replaceable, an obstacle. And I didn't notice the tears until they hit the dough, salty, warm, heavy with everything I refused to say out loud. Didn't wipe them away. I just kept working, letting the rhythm pull me back into myself. The bell on the front door chimed, hours later, even though I hadn't flipped the sign to open. I glanced up, ready to scold some early customer, but it wasn't a customer. It was the person I trusted with my whole history, the only one who knew the truth of my books, the truth of my strength, the truth of how much I was worth. The elder who had guided this business since the beginning, appearing in my doorway wearing worry like a scarf, thick and obvious. He sat across from me, watching my hands, watching my face, and I knew he already understood that the situation had shifted from disrespect to danger. I told him everything, not carefully, not strategically, but truthfully. The smashed urn, the forged papers, the manipulation, the lies, the way the man had smiled as if he already owned my life. And we sat there for a long moment, letting the truth settle between us, like flour floating down before it lands. He asked the question that had been tugging at the edges of my mind since the confrontation, the question I was scared to let myself answer. What are you prepared to do about it? And, for the first time since everything shattered, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity, sharp, steady, unyielding. I told him I was done letting people think I was fragile, done letting people mistake kindness for weakness, done letting someone else's greed shape the future I built with my own hands. He nodded, slowly, like someone who'd been waiting years to hear me say it. Then he pulled out paperwork, pages that could shield me, pages that could sever access, pages that could protect what mattered. And I signed, even though the pen shook slightly. I signed, because self-defense doesn't always look like locks or alarms. Sometimes it looks like signatures drawn with trembling determination. After he left, I made myself tea and sat in the quiet, letting the weight of protection start to form around me like a shell. The phone rang again, this time not trembling apologies but legal confirmation, a restraining line drawn in invisible ink around my life. A promise that the man who tried to crush my spirit couldn't legally come near me. And yet I knew people like him don't obey boundaries made of paper. They test them, push them, break them, if they think there's anything left to take. The warning became proof 2 mornings later, when I stepped downstairs at 4 a.m. and found the word witch smeared across my window, in thick black strokes dripping onto the sidewalk, like accusation turned into tar. The sight stole my breath, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything I already understood. It wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to claim the narrative, make me out to be unstable, dramatic, unreasonable, a woman unraveling. Instead of a woman standing her ground, I cleaned the window with the help of a friend who didn't ask questions, just scrubbed beside me, humming softly until the glass shone again, and in the shine I saw myself reflected. Older, yes, tired, yes, but also unbroken, still rising, still rooted in a place he would never truly understand. I baked through the day, letting the hum of the ovens drown the restless noise in my mind. Customers came and went, unaware that every loaf on the rack was holding me together piece by piece. Later in the afternoon, as the light shifted to a softer gold, I stood behind the counter, thinking about the daughter who used to live inside the shell of the woman who'd walked away from me, thinking about when innocence turns into obedience, when fear becomes loyalty to the wrong person. Thinking about how manipulation doesn't always look like chains. Sometimes it looks like promises. Whispered in someone's weakest hour, the bell chimed again, and this time it was the daughter, standing hesitant in the doorway, her shoulders small, her eyes swollen, her voice soft. I didn't speak first. I wanted her to hear the weight of the silence to understand that broken trust isn't repaired. With a few tears, she sat at one of the tables, hands clasped tight like someone praying for mercy. I didn't offer mercy. I offered truth, told her what manipulation looks like, told her what betrayal tastes like, told her what happens when you let someone convince you that your own blood is the enemy, she cried. The way people cry when truth burns. Going in hot, painful cleansing, she told me more, lies the man had spun around her, weaving a web so tight she didn't realize she was trapped, until it started choking her. And as she spoke, I realized she wasn't defending him anymore. She was unraveling the spell, thread by thread, terrified, ashamed, waking up from a dream she never meant to fall into. She reached for my hand tentatively, like she wasn't sure she deserved to, and I let her take it. Not because forgiveness had arrived, but because recognition had. She was starting to see again, starting to think again, starting to become person. She once was a person the man had tried to erase after she left. The bakery felt different, quieter, yes, but deeper too, like something had shifted back into place, not fixed, not healed, but on the path toward it. And I realized something as I locked the door that night, something simple, something powerful. The man had thought he could break me by taking what I loved, but all he'd done was show me what needed protection, what needed rebuilding, what needed reclaiming. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready, ready for whatever came next, because for the first time since this nightmare began, the ground under my feet felt solid again, and I could feel the future tilting slightly toward me, not away from me. Not because the danger was gone, but because I finally remembered who I was and what I'd built. A woman who doesn't bow, a woman who doesn't break, a woman who rises even when everything else tries to push her down. The morning after the window was cleaned, I woke with a strange stillness in my chest, not calm exactly, but a kind of sharpened steadiness, like the world had finally stopped spinning long enough for me to choose where to stand. And as I moved through the apartment, I felt something quiet but fierce forming inside me, the kind of resolve that doesn't scream. It just holds its ground until the earth moves around it. I went downstairs and the bakery greeted me like it always did. Warm light, waiting ovens, humming low as if they already knew today would tilt in a new direction. I turned on the mixer, listening to the thick rhythm of dough forming, and I realized I wasn't working from fear anymore. I was working from certainty, the certainty that the person who tried to take everything wasn't done, and that I needed to take the next step before he could attempt the next. Strike. The elder advisor called just after sunrise, his voice low but edged with purpose. He spoke of documents, uncovered, transactions, traced signatures, forged money, pulled through accounts that didn't belong to him, pathways of deceit laid bare like footprints in wet cement, undeniable and permanent. He asked if I was still sure about pressing forward, still sure about letting justice bite down instead of backing away, and for once there was no tremor in my answer. I told him yes, yes, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who spent decades building something, only to have someone try to take it because he mistook her softness for surrender. Every mother who'd been lied to, every worker underestimated, every person told they were too old, too slow, too fragile, too stuck in the past. I wasn't fighting for the bakery alone. Now I was fighting for the woman who had carried it on her back for 35 years and refused to let someone else rewrite her story. After the call, I wiped flour from my hands and stood in the quiet, letting that truth settle into the cracks. The doorbell rang again. Not customers, not yet, but the officer assigned to the case. His expression serious, his presence solid. He explained the charges, the evidence, the next steps, each sentence stacking on top of the last until it felt like bricks being placed around me, not walls but fortifications. He said the man would be arrested formally. He said the man had stolen, not just from me but from the daughter he claimed to love. He said consequences were coming, heavy, real, unavoidable. I thanked him and locked the door after he left, pressing my palm to the cool metal, breathing in slowly, out slowly, trying to absorb all of it. Then the call came, the one I half expected, but still wasn't ready for. The daughter's voice, trembling, stuttering, unraveling. She said they'd taken him away in handcuffs. She said she didn't understand everything yet. She said she didn't know who she'd married, who she'd trusted, who she'd let whisper into her life. I listened, without interrupting, letting her speak, letting her spill the grief, the shame, the disbelief, letting her purge the poison. He'd fed her for years, and somewhere in her fractured words I heard awakening. I heard a woman beginning to pull herself out of a shadow she didn't realize she'd been living in. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Some truths needed to wait, until her grief settled enough for her to see clearly. But I told her what mattered, that she was safe, that she still had a home to return to if she chose that. Rebuilding was possible if she wanted it, if she worked for it, if she owned her part in it. She cried until her breath turned ragged, and then she whispered something that made my throat tighten. She said she wanted to come home, not to stay. Not to move back, but to stand in the place she had abandoned, and see it with her real eyes again, not the ones he had shaped for her. I told her yes, and when she arrived later that day, she stood just inside the doorway, small, unsure, trembling like someone facing the wreckage of a life. She thought she understood. She walked slowly, touching the counter, the shelves, the tables, the walls, as if reacquainting herself with a language she hadn't spoken in years, and we watched the realization spill over her in waves. The bakery wasn't weak. The bakery wasn't failing. The bakery wasn't outdated or dying. Those were stories fed to her by someone who needed her blind, someone who profited from her ignorance, looked at me with a face full of cracks and whispered, "I didn't know, I didn't know, I didn't know," and I believed her, not because she hadn't failed me, but because manipulation can make a person see ghosts where there are none, and monsters where there is love. She asked if I hated her, and I didn't. Lie, I said. I was hurt deeply, profoundly. But hate wasn't the right word, not for someone trying to climb back, not for someone willing to look at what she'd done without excuses. She asked what came next, and I told her the truth. The next step wasn't mine. It was hers. She had to decide if she wanted to rebuild, not with grand gestures or apologies soaked in tears, but with small, consistent acts that proved she saw me again. Not just the image he painted of me. She nodded, slowly, as if memorizing the weight of every syllable, and then she left, promising to come back when she could stand a little straighter, when she could speak without shaking, when she could think without his voice echoing in her head. I returned to the kitchen and finished the dough I had left resting, earlier, shaping it into loaves, pressing strength into each one as if they were anchors for the life was reclaiming. As evening settled, I sat alone in the apartment, thinking about the man who had tried to tear apart decades of work, thinking about the daughter caught in his net, thinking about the invisible wealth I'd spent years protecting. And finally, I felt something shift. Not fear, not anger, but liberation. The chains he tried to place on my life had snapped one by one, and all he had left behind was proof of who he truly was, and proof of who I had always been, stronger than he believed, smarter than he expected, steadier than he could ever understand. I inhaled deep, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, and I whispered it to the empty room, not a prayer, not a vow, just truth. I'm not done. And tomorrow, when the ovens heat, before dawn, when the neighborhood fills the shop again, when the world turns the way it always does, I'll be right where I've always been, standing in the place he thought he could steal, rising in the place he tried to break, ready for whatever comes next. The night settled over the bakery like a warm blanket, and I sat alone at the small wooden table that still held faint knife marks from years of slicing bread and memories, and suddenly everything felt both impossibly heavy and unbearably clear, as if the world had finally stopped trying to hide its intentions, and instead laid them in front of me, one after another, until all I could do was breathe through the truth of it, the truth that survival isn't quiet. It isn't gentle. It isn't the soft kind of strength. People like to talk about survival is sharp. It is loud inside your bones. It is choosing again and again not to be broken, even when someone is grinding their heel into your life and calling it help. I let the day roll through me. Every betrayal, every confession, every piece of the story that had been peeled back until it left nerves exposed and raw. And yet there was something else, something unexpected, humming beneath it all. Not grief, not anger. Something like rebirth, like the moment dough stops being just flour and water and becomes something alive, something that rises on its own just because it was meant to. I walked downstairs to the bakery floor, the air still warm from the afternoon, the faint scent of sugar and yeast clinging to the walls. The space felt different tonight. Not threatened, not fragile, rooted as if it had planted itself deeper. Just because someone tried to rip it out, I traced my fingers along the edge of the counter. The same edge my husband once sanded smooth, and I thought of him not as ashes in a shattered urn, but as presence, as echo, as the quiet voice that had always reminded me to trust the work, trust the process, trust myself. I whispered that into the empty room now. Trust yourself. And for the first time in months I felt every part of me answer back. I locked the front door and stepped outside. The street was empty, the lights along the sidewalk flickering with a soft rhythm, the cool air brushing my face like a reminder that the world keeps breathing, even when your own lungs threaten to collapse. I thought about the daughter, the way her voice cracked when truth finally caught her, thought about the way she looked at the place she had once loved, but had forgotten in someone else's darkness, thought about the question she asked me, how I could forgive her, and the strange thing was I already knew the answer, because forgiveness wasn't a gift, it was a choice, a doorway, and she had finally reached for the handle with her own trembling hand, and that was a start, I thought, about the man who tried to destroy everything, who saw price where there was worth, who saw opportunity where there was legacy, who saw weakness where there was resilience. And I realized something simple and startling. He never stood a chance. Not really, not against 35 years of sweat and dawn and cinnamon. Not against a community that rose like bread around me. Not against a woman who'd once been taught by her grandmother to hide her wealth, but never her strength. I walked back inside, switched on a single light and moved through the kitchen, touching the tools that had shaped my life. The fasting steel bowl, the wooden spoon, the rolling pin, smoothed by decades of work, every item, a testament, every mark a story. And I realized that revenge had already happened, not in court, not in arrests, not in the humiliation he brought upon himself. Revenge was alive in the fact that he failed, that he underestimated the wrong woman, the wrong mother, the wrong keeper of something far bigger than money. The dough rises at its own pace. He never understood that I cleaned the counters slowly, intentionally, the way you do when something in you needs ritual, not cleanliness. And as I wiped each surface, I felt the last pieces of fear slip out of my body. Like smoke leaving a room, I was rebuilding, not because I'd lost everything, but because I refused to lose anything that mattered. I went upstairs and stood by the window, the street below washed in yellow light, the bakery sign glowing faintly, and I felt something settle into place. A promise, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. I will protect this. I will protect myself. I will protect the future, even if I have to shape it like dough and let it rise again and again until it becomes what it was always meant to be. And in that quiet final moment, I understood the ending. Wasn't an ending at all, it was the first real beginning I'd had in years. Tomorrow I would unlock the door at exactly 4 a.m. And tomorrow, the ovens would glow again. Tomorrow the daughter would step through the doorway with a face washed clean of lies. Tomorrow the neighborhood would gather, not because they needed bread, but because they cared. Tomorrow everything would start again, rising, rebuilding, renewing, and I would meet it all with steady hands, even if they shook a little, because strength doesn't mean stillness. It means refusing to stop. Tomorrow I would be here, still standing, still rising, still mine.